I hate the way he breathes. That is what Margaret told me. Margaret is 62 years old. She is a woman who, by all accounts, has lived a pristine, admirable life. She has been married for 38 years to a man who doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, and has never raised a hand against her. They have 3 grown children and 4 grandchildren. They live in a beautiful home with a paid-off mortgage. And yet, Margaret sat on the beige sofa in my consulting room, twisting a tissue until it shredded in her hands, and confessed that sometimes, when she hears her husband's key turn in the front door lock, she feels a wave of nausea so violent she has to grip the kitchen counter to keep from screaming. She told me she loves her family, but lately, when they gather for Sunday dinner, when she sees her daughter laughing or her husband telling the same story for the 100th time, she doesn't feel love. She feels a hot, black, suffocating sensation in her chest. She feels resentment. And then, immediately after the resentment, she feels a crushing guilt because she knows she should be happy. She has everything she was promised. So why does she feel like she is suffocating? This is the great taboo of female aging. We are taught that as women get older, they soften into benevolence, becoming the wise grandmothers, the content matriarchs, but the reality I have seen in my clinical practice is often starkly different. There is a silent epidemic of rage among women over 50. It is a secret, burning resentment toward the very people they dedicated their lives to serving, their husbands and their children. If you have ever felt a sudden flash of irritation when your husband asks you where the butter is, or a deep, inexplicable sadness when you look at your adult children's lives, you are not crazy, and you are not a bad person, but you are in danger. You are caught in a psychological trap that the great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung understood better than anyone else. This isn't about your husband being annoying. It isn't about your kids being ungrateful. It is about something much deeper, something happening inside your own soul that you have likely never been given the language to understand. I am a clinical psychologist with decades of experience specializing in the psychology of women and relationships, specifically in the second half of life. I have sat with hundreds of women like Margaret, and I want to tell you something that might shock you. The resentment you feel is not actually about your family. It is a symptom of a psycho-spiritual crisis within yourself. It is a signal from your unconscious mind that something vital has been sacrificed, and it is demanding to be heard. In this video, we are going to dissect this resentment using the lens of Jungian psychology. We are going to look at the shadow, the persona, and the concept of the unlived life. This is dangerous territory because it requires you to look at your own choices, not just the behavior of those around you. But if you ignore this, the consequences are severe. I have seen this resentment metabolize into physical illness, autoimmune disorders, chronic pain, mysterious fatigue. I have seen it destroy marriages that survived the turbulent years only to crumble in the quiet ones. I have seen it lead to what Jung called a spiritual death. Please, before we descend into the depths of the psyche, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I ask this not for vanity, but because the algorithm tends to bury content that deals with the darker, more complex realities of older women's psychology. By subscribing, you help other women find this lifeline. And I want you to stay with me until the very end of this video. In the final few minutes, I am going to give you a set of self-diagnostic questions, a litmus test, that will reveal if you are currently operating out of your shadow and how close you are to a breaking point. These questions can change the way you see your entire history. To understand why you resent your husband and family, we have to start with the first and perhaps most pervasive pattern I see in my practice. I call this danger the shadow of the perfect mother. In Jungian psychology, The persona is the mask we wear to face the world. It is the role we play: the good wife, the selfless mother, the dutiful daughter. For women of your generation, the pressure to perfect this persona was immense. You were likely raised with the implicit instruction to be accommodating, to be the emotional shock absorber for the household. You learned that to be good meant to put others first. And so, you did. You spent 20, 30, or 40 years suppressing your own needs, your own anger, your own hunger, and your own ambition in service of the family unit. But Jung discovered a fundamental law of the psyche. Nothing ever just goes away. When you suppress a natural human impulse like selfishness, aggression, or desire, it doesn't vanish. It goes into the shadow. The shadow is the basement of the unconscious. It is where we throw everything that doesn't fit our polite persona. If you spend 40 years being the giver, your shadow becomes the taker. If you spend 40 years being the peacemaker, your shadow is full of rage and war. The danger here is that the shadow doesn't stay in the basement. Eventually, it starts to leak out. And for many women in their 50s and 60s, it leaks out as resentment. Let me tell you about a client named Helen. Helen was the ultimate matriarch. She baked the bread, she drove the carpools, she managed her husband's social calendar, she nursed her aging parents. She was a saint. But when she turned 60, something snapped. Her husband retired, and suddenly, his presence in the house all day was intolerable to her. She started picking fights over trivial things: the way he loaded the dishwasher, the volume of the television. She felt that she had paid her dues, and now it was her turn to be served. But no one was serving her. The family was confused. They were used to the saint, and they didn't know how to handle this new, bitter woman. Helen was suffering from what Jung calls enantiodromia, where a psychic force turns into its opposite. She had been so extremely selfless that her psyche was now demanding extreme selfishness to balance the scales. She resented them because they were the beneficiaries of her sacrifice, and now that she was depleted, she hated them for taking what she had freely given. The tragedy of the shadow of the perfect mother is that the family usually has no idea a transaction was taking place. They thought you did those things because you loved it. They didn't know you were keeping a ledger. Now, you are presenting them with a bill for 30 years of sacrifice, and they cannot pay it. This leads to a profound sense of isolation. You feel used, and they feel ambushed. The resentment festers because you are waiting for a thank you that is big enough to justify a lost life. But no such thank you exists. The concrete rule for this pattern is this: you must stop waiting for your family to repay you for sacrifices they never asked you to make. You must acknowledge that your goodness had a cost, and you are the only one who can pay that debt to yourself now. The second hidden pattern is even more subtle and perhaps more painful to admit. It is what I call the projection of the unlived life. Carl Jung wrote one of the most haunting sentences in the history of psychology. Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. What does this mean? It means that the dreams, talents, and potentials you sacrificed or ignored do not die. They become ghosts. And because you cannot bear the pain of looking at your own unlived potential, you project it onto your family. This often manifests in two distinct ways: envy of your children or contempt for your husband. Let's look at the case of Susan. Susan was a brilliant writer in college, but she married young, had 3 children, and took a stable administrative job to support her husband's fluctuating income as a consultant. Now, at 58, her youngest daughter is 24. This daughter is traveling the world, dating freely, making art, and living with a kind of reckless freedom that Susan never allowed herself. Susan found herself constantly criticizing her daughter. "She's irresponsible," Susan would say. "She's wasting her life. She needs to get serious." In therapy, it became clear that Susan didn't actually think her daughter was wasting her life. Susan was jealous. She was looking at her daughter and seeing the life she herself had been too afraid to claim. But a mother isn't allowed to be jealous of her child, so that jealousy was converted into resentment and criticism. With husbands, this pattern often looks like contempt. If you sacrificed your adventurous side to marry a safe man, you might find yourself, decades later, despising him for being boring. You resent him for the very safety you chose. You blame him for clipping your wings, when in reality, you handed him the scissors. You look at him sitting in his armchair and you think, "Is this it? Is this all there is?" You resent him not for what he is doing, but for what he represents, the limitation of your own destiny. You have made him the jailer because that is easier than admitting you walked into the cell and locked the door yourself. The consequences of this projection are devastating. It creates a toxic wedge between mothers and daughters. The daughter feels judged and unloved, never realizing that her mother is actually envious of her freedom. It creates a cold war in marriages, where the wife punishes the husband for being exactly who he always was. The resentment is a defense mechanism. It protects you from the grief of your unlived life. If it's their fault, you don't have to mourn what you didn't do. If it's their fault, you don't have to take responsibility for your own happiness now. The concrete rule for this pattern is, you must reclaim your own unlived life immediately, in whatever form is still possible, rather than punishing your family for living theirs. Now, we must move to the third danger, which is specific to the dynamic of the empty nest and the aging marriage. I call this the collapse of the functional role. For decades, your relationships were defined by function. You were the manager of the household, the logistics coordinator, the nurturer. Your husband was the provider, the fixer, the co-parent. There was a mission: raise the kids, pay the mortgage, keep the machine running. You were teammates. But now, the mission is largely complete. The kids are gone. The mortgage is manageable. The frantic pace has slowed. And in this silence, you are left looking at your husband and realizing that without the function of the family, you aren't sure how to relate to him. Jung spoke about the difference between the first half of life and the second half. The first half is about building the ego and the container career, family, status. The second half is about the soul. The resentment many women feel comes from trying to run a second half life marriage with first half life rules. You might still be trying to manage him. You might be trying to optimize him, fix him, or direct him as if he were an employee or a child. But he is tired of being managed, and frankly, you are tired of managing. Yet, you don't know how to stop. This manifests as a pattern I call the bitter manager. I had a client, Patricia, 65. She spent the first 10 minutes of every session complaining about her husband's incompetence. He bought the wrong lettuce. He forgot to call the plumber. He drives too slow. Her resentment was volcanic. But when we dug deeper, we found that Patricia was terrified. If she stopped managing him, if she stopped fussing and correcting and directing, she would have to face the void between them. She would have to face the fact that they hadn't had a real, vulnerable conversation in 20 years. Her resentment was a shield. It kept her busy. It kept her in the superior position. As long as she was angry at his incompetence, she didn't have to feel the loneliness of her own marriage. The danger here is that this constant criticism, this death by 1,000 cuts, eventually drives the husband away. He withdraws into silence, into the garage, or into the television, which only fuels your resentment more. You interpret his withdrawal as lack of care, but it is actually self-preservation. He cannot survive your scrutiny. The bitter manager destroys intimacy because intimacy requires equality, and you cannot be equal with someone you are constantly correcting. The concrete rule for this pattern is, you must resign from your position as the general manager of the universe. Your husband's mistakes are not a reflection of your worth, and your competence is no longer the primary currency of your value. It kept her busy. It kept her in the superior position. As long as she was angry at his incompetence, she didn't have to feel the loneliness of her own marriage. The danger here is that this constant criticism, this death by 1,000 cuts, eventually drives the husband away. He withdraws into silence, into the garage, or into the television, which only fuels your resentment more. You interpret his withdrawal as lack of care, but it is actually self-preservation. He cannot survive your scrutiny. The bitter manager destroys intimacy because intimacy requires equality, and you cannot be equal with someone you are constantly correcting. The concrete rule for this pattern is, you must resign from your position as the general manager of the universe. Your husband's mistakes are not a reflection of your worth, and your competence is no longer the primary currency of your value. There is a fourth pattern, and it is perhaps the most controversial. It involves the Jungian concept of the animus. In Jungian theory, the animus is the unconscious masculine side of a woman. It represents her capacity for logic, assertion, focus, and spirit. When a woman is young, she often projects her animus onto men. She looks for a man to be strong, decisive, and successful for her. But, as a woman ages, the task of individuation requires her to integrate her own animus. She needs to become her own authority. She needs to find her own voice. However, if a woman ignores this call, if she refuses to develop her own strength and authority, her animus turns negative. A negative animus acts like a demon in the ear. It becomes a critical, opinionated, argumentative inner voice. And here is the trap. This internal, critical voice gets turned outward onto the husband. I see this in women who become obsessed with being right. They will argue points of logic, or politics, or household management with a ferocity that is disproportionate to the topic. They resent their husbands for being stupid or illogical. This is the negative animus possessing the woman. She is using her husband as a punching bag for her own undeveloped masculine energy. She is angry because she wants to be powerful, she wants to be heard, she wants to have agency. But she has stuck to the old script of being the supportive wife. So, her power comes out sideways as sharpness, sarcasm, and resentment. I recall a woman named Brenda. Brenda was incredibly smart, perhaps smarter than her husband. But she belonged to a generation where she downplayed her intelligence to not intimidate men. Now, at 60, that suppressed intelligence had curdled into a weapon. She would publicly correct her husband's grammar. She would roll her eyes when he spoke. She resented him for not being the intellectual giant she wanted him to be. But the truth was, Brenda wanted to be the giant. She wanted to write, to speak, to lead. Because she wouldn't do it herself, she punished him for not doing it for her. The concrete rule for this pattern is, if you are resentful of your husband's lack of power or intellect, it is a sign that you are starving for your own. You must feed your mind and your ambition directly, rather than feeding on him. Let's zoom out for a moment. Why is this so deadly? Why am I framing this as a crisis? Because resentment is not a passive emotion. It is an active, corrosive acid. When you hold this level of resentment toward your family, your body keeps the score. In my practice, I have seen a direct correlation between repressed matriarchal rage and chronic health issues. High blood pressure, insomnia, fibromyalgia, digestive disorders. These are often the somatic expressions of words that were never spoken and boundaries that were never set. Your body is screaming no monoxide because your mouth kept saying yes. Furthermore, this resentment destroys your legacy. I know that is a heavy word, but we must look at it. You want to be remembered as the loving heart of the family. But if you are operating from this place of hidden bitterness, that is not what your children will feel. Children, even adult ones, are incredibly intuitive. They feel the heaviness in your house. They feel the strings attached to your love. They might start pulling a wave, visiting less, calling less, and this creates a vicious cycle. You resent them for abandoning you after all you did. So you become more critical and needy when they do call, which makes them pull away further. It is a tragic spiral that ends in a lonely old age, the very thing you were sacrificing yourself to avoid. So, what is the solution? How do we break these patterns? The answer lies in what Jung called individuation. This is the process of becoming your true, whole self, separating who you are from the roles you have played. The first step is to dismantle the good mother and good wife persona. You have to accept that it is okay to be a bad mother, sometimes, if bad means having boundaries, saying no, and spending your money on yourself. You have to stop viewing your family as your masterpiece. They are not your pottery to be molded. They are separate human beings with their own destinies. We need to look at a healthy alternative. I have seen couples transform their marriages in their 60s by moving from a functional partnership to a soul partnership. This means the contract changes. The new contract says, I am no longer here to take care of you. I am here to witness you, and to be witnessed by you. This might mean living apart together, in the same house, having separate hobbies, separate schedules, separate bank accounts, and coming together only when you both genuinely want to. It means retiring from the job of wife and mother, and simply being a woman who shares her life with these people. I remember one client, Evelyn, who stopped cooking dinner. Just stopped. She told her husband and adult sons who were visiting, I've cooked about 15,000 dinners in my life. I'm done. I'm retiring from the kitchen. At first, they were shocked. They were annoyed. But Evelyn held her ground. She started taking painting classes in the evenings. She bought takeout for herself, if they didn't want to cook. And something miraculous happened. The resentment vanished. Because she wasn't serving them like a servant, she could enjoy their company as peers. Her husband learned to cook. They started talking about art and politics instead of grocery lists. By reclaiming her autonomy, she saved the relationship. You have to ask yourself, how do you want to be remembered? Do you want to be remembered as the martyr who sighed loudly while doing the dishes? Or do you want to be remembered as a woman who was vibrant, who had a self, who loved her family but didn't need them to validate her existence? This is about your emotional legacy. But it is also about your survival. You have a third act to live. You cannot live it carrying a 50-pound bag of rocks called resentment. I promised you earlier that I would give you a set of self-diagnostic questions. I want you to close your eyes for a moment, or just soften your gaze, and answer these honestly. No one is listening but you. 1. When you are alone in the house, do you feel a sense of relief? And when you hear the car pull into the driveway, does that relief instantly turn into tension or fatigue? 2. Do you have a secret fantasy of running away, living in a small apartment alone, or perhaps being a widow? This is very common. Do not judge it, just acknowledge it. 3. Do you frequently feel that your family owes you? though you can't quite explain what the debt is or how they should pay it. 4. When your husband or children tell you good news about their lives, is your first split-second reaction a flash of annoyance or envy before you put on your happy face? 5. Do you feel that your real self is something you had to lock away in a box 30 years ago, and now you don't know where the key is? 5. Do you feel that your real self is something you had to lock away in a box 30 years ago, and now you don't know where the key is? 6. Do you find yourself replaying arguments or hurts from 20 years ago as if they happened this morning? If you answered yes to more than 2 of these, you are deep in the grip of the Jungian patterns we discussed. You are carrying the shadow. But here is the hopeful reframe. This resentment is actually good news. I know that sounds strange, but resentment is frozen vitality. It is energy. It is your life force trying to wake you up. The fact that you are angry means you are not dead. It means you still have a fire inside you that wants to burn. The goal is not to extinguish the fire, but to take it out of the basement and put it in the hearth where it belongs. You can use this energy to fuel your own renaissance. You can use it to draw boundaries. You can use it to finally, after all these years, introduce yourself to your family. Not as mum or honey, but as you asterisk. The woman who has dreams, who has limits, who has a shadow. It is scary to drop the mask. But the mask is heavy, and you have carried it long enough. The Jungian journey of the second half of life is to move from relationship to others to relationship with the self. Paradoxically, when you heal the relationship with yourself, when you stop abandoning yourself, you will find that you stop resenting your family. You can forgive them for not making you happy, because you realize that was never their job. It was always yours. And it is a job you are finally ready to accept.